She was the poorest woman in the room, and the only one who could actually read the dead language that would humble a duke, expose a fraud, and rewrite British history. This is the untold enemies to lovers historical romance every Bridgerton fan has been searching for. Dust hung suspended in the shafts of morning light pouring through the tall arched windows of the Royal Historical Society, and silence ruled the reading room, broken only by the scratch of quills and the whisper of ancient vellum. Nobody looked twice at the woman in the faded grey muslin sorting through the discard pile in the corner. They should have. Because when Julian Ashgrove, the Duke of Ravensmoor, stood before Oxford's finest and confidently declared a freshly unearthed Roman manuscript utterly unreadable, he made the fatal mistake of laughing at her first. Eleanor Ashcombe rubbed the ache from her right thumb. Her knuckles carried the permanent stain of oak gall ink, a deep bruised colour no amount of scrubbing with lye soap could ever fully erase. It was an occupational hazard she had long since stopped resenting. Polite society prized pristine white gloves and unblemished skin. Polite society did not, however, pay the grocer's bill. Ghostwriting translations for men with Oxford degrees and no real grasp of a complex ablative absolute did. She sat in the coldest, draftiest corner of the reading room. Dr. Horace Pemberton, her employer and London's supposed foremost authority on Roman antiquities, was slumped asleep at the main table, having consumed far too much port at his club the night before, his head resting heavily on a stack of preliminary translations Eleanor had finished before dawn. It was a cynical arrangement, and Eleanor knew it plainly. She possessed the sharp, disciplined mind of a classicist, inherited from a father who had been far better at teaching Latin and Greek to his only daughter than he had ever been at managing his own finances. When he died, leaving her a mountain of debt and a mind too brilliant for a quiet governess post, she had found Pemberton. He needed a gifted assistant to prop up his academic reputation. She needed a roof over her head. They despised one another, but money changed hands every Friday, so Eleanor kept her mouth shut and her head down. Then footsteps shattered the suffocating quiet, not the shuffling gait of aging scholars, but boots striking marble with a decisive, military cadence. Eleanor did not look up right away. She kept her eyes fixed on the crumbling edge of the scroll before her, refusing to be distracted, though the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Younger scholars scrambled to their feet. Chairs scraped violently against the floor. Pemberton startled awake, wiping drool from his chin, frantically straightening his crumpled cravat. Eleanor finally allowed herself a glance. Julian, Duke of Ravensmoor, carried a reputation that generally arrived in a room several minutes ahead of him. He was wealthy enough to buy the entire society and turn it into a private stable, and cynical enough to actually consider it. He had spent for years fighting in the Peninsular War and returned not with a chest of medals but with a limp he tried to hide and a bone-deep intolerance for aristocratic posturing. He stood in the doorway flanked by two footmen carrying an iron-bound chest, entirely out of place among the dusty shelves and tweed-clad scholars, his tailored dark blue coat fitted perfectly across broad shoulders, dark hair brushed back in a careless style that had likely taken his valet an hour to perfect. It was his eyes that caught Eleanor's attention, a sharp, cold grey, sweeping the room with undisguised disdain. "Dr. Pemberton," he said, his voice a low baritone cutting through the dusty air like a blade, "I was told I would find you here, hard at work." Pemberton lurched forward, bowing so low he nearly toppled. "Your Grace, an unexpected honour. We are always labouring in the vineyard of history, as it were." Eleanor rolled her eyes and dropped her gaze back to her parchment. Vineyard of history. Pemberton couldn't tell a vineyard from a cabbage patch unless someone poured it into a crystal glass for him. "Spare me the poetry," Ravensmoor said, gesturing for the footman to set the chest on the table with a resounding thud that sent dust pluming into the air. "My estate manager uncovered a Roman vault beneath the foundation of my secondary property in Bath. Mostly pottery shards and rubbish, but there was a locked box inside. And inside that box," he nodded, and one of the footmen unlatched the lid, "was a manuscript." Every scholar in the room gravitated toward the table like starving dogs to butcher's scraps. Even Eleanor felt a traitorous flicker of curiosity. To the Romans, Bath had been aquisulis. If a sealed box had survived untouched in the mud, it could hold anything: military logs, private letters, curse tablets. It appears to be a manuscript, Ravensmoor said, sounding thoroughly bored, sealed in wax and remarkably well preserved thanks to a lack of oxygen inside the case. The British Museum offered a small fortune sight unseen. And you brought it here first? Pemberton asked, his voice trembling with naked greed. I want it translated first, Ravensmoor replied. If it's philosophy, I may keep it. If it's a grain ledger, the museum is welcome to it. The Prime Minister assured me you were the man to read it, Pemberton. I expect a preliminary summary within the hour. I do not have all day. Pemberton paled, his eyes darting nervously to the dark corner where Eleanor sat today. She offered him a tight, entirely unhelpful smile. Let him sweat. Within the hour, Your Grace, Pemberton stammered, such ancient dialects, the deterioration of the syntax, it requires delicate, deliberate study. Open it, Ravensmoor commanded, ignoring the excuse completely. Pemberton reached into the chest with trembling hands and lifted out a thick roll of vellum, beautifully preserved, dark ink stark against pale, aged skin. He unrolled the first few inches, adjusted his spectacles, and brought his face mere inches from the text. Eleanor watched the colour drain entirely from her employer's face. He was hopelessly out of his depth. The silence in the room stretched, growing heavier with every passing second. Pemberton was about to fail, and to humiliate himself before one of the most powerful, unforgiving men in England. Eleanor felt a sharp, vindictive spike of pleasure. Then Pemberton looked at her again, desperation raw in his eyes, and gave the smallest, almost imperceptible jerk of his head toward the manuscript. Help me. Eleanor let him suffer another 10 seconds, taking her time wiping excess ink from her quill before rising slowly from her stool. Her faded dress rustled quietly as she crossed the vast, echoing room. The circle of scholars parted, as though by accident, as she approached Pemberton's elbow. She did not look at the Duke. She looked only at the vellum. The script sprawled aggressively across the page, not the neat block letters of an official decree, but the rapid, slanted cursive of someone writing in a furious hurry. It was personal. It was violently angry. Well, Ravensmoor demanded, his patience visibly fraying, is it an epic, a legal treatise, a recipe for fermented fish sauce? Pemberton cleared his throat, a pathetic sound in the cavernous room. It is highly irregular, Your Grace. The Latin is degenerate, post-classical, perhaps, or heavily localized. I see the word imperator, but the surrounding context is muddled. Muddled, Ravensmoor repeated, his tone dangerously flat. You are paid an exorbitant stipend by the Crown, Pemberton, to unmuddle these things. Eleanor leaned closer to the text. She had not meant to speak, it was a reflex born of years correcting her father's struggling students. It's not muddled, she murmured, her voice barely carrying over the anxious breathing of the academics. It's a military colloquialism. Camp slang. The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a glass pond. Every head snapped toward her. Pemberton looked as though he wished the floorboards would open and swallow him whole. Ravensmoor turned slowly, looking at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time, his cold grey eyes sweeping over her ink-stained fingers, her plain dress, the stray lock of brown hair escaping her practical bun. His lips curved into a slow, devastating smirk of pure aristocratic condescension. And who is this? Ravensmoor asked, addressing Pemberton but keeping his eyes locked on Eleanor. Your scullery maid has opinions on Roman military linguistics. She is merely my copyist, Your Grace, Pemberton squeaked, physically trying to block Eleanor from the table with his shoulder. A simple girl. She doesn't know what she's saying. Clearly, Ravensmoor drawled, crossing his arms over his broad chest, the smirk deepening. She can't read Latin. Run along, girl. Leave history to the men who actually understand it. A hot, bright spark of fury ignited in Eleanor's chest. She had spent 5 years swallowing her pride, 5 years watching incompetent men steal her words and her brilliance simply because they possessed a tailored coat and a club membership. She had survived on scraps while they dined on steak. She was entirely done starving. Eleanor did not retreat. She stepped around Pemberton and planted herself firmly at the edge of the great oak table, directly across from the Duke of Ravensmoor, meeting his cold stare with a blazing ferocity of her own. "It is a letter," Eleanor said, her voice no longer a murmur but clear, resonant, dripping with an authority that made the surrounding scholars flinch. "Written by a senior tribune of the 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix, stationed in Britain around the year 61, at the time of Boudicca's rebellion." Ravensmoor's smirk faltered, just a fraction. Eleanor looked down at the sprawling cursive, reading the ancient, bitter anger as easily as the Morning Post. "He is writing to his brother in Rome," she continued, her ink-stained finger tracing the air above the delicate vellum without touching it. "He is furious." Dr. Pemberton saw the word imperator and assumed it was a formal decree. "It isn't. The Tribune is being brutally sarcastic." Eleanor drew a breath, letting the rhythm of the dead language fill her lungs. When she spoke the Latin aloud, it was not the stiff, church-bound chant of the scholars. It was alive, angry, rhythmic, and painfully human. She did not stumble on a single syllable, her pronunciation flawless, sharp with the hard consonants of the classical era. The room was paralyzed. Pemberton's jaw hung open. Eleanor locked eyes with Ravensmoor again. "Would your Grace prefer a literal translation, or the true spirit of the text?" Ravensmoor stared at her, the smirk entirely gone, replaced by an expression of intense, sharpened focus. "The spirit," he said softly. "Very well," Eleanor squared her shoulders. "Lucius sends greetings to his brother. If I stay in this British mud any longer, I think I might declare myself emperor. It is easier to govern pigs than these barbarians, and easier still than listening to our own commanders. We are freezing. Our supplies were stolen by locals who smiled at us while they did it. And the general insists on marching us in perfect squares while the enemy hides in the bogs. Send wine. If you cannot send wine, send a dagger, so I might end my own misery before the damp rots my feet off." She stopped. The silence in the Royal Historical Society was absolute, heavy and suffocating, the sound of deeply entrenched worldviews shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Nobody breathed. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. Eleanor stepped back from the table, looked at the circle of pale, speechless academics, then finally at the Duke. Ravensmoor was no longer looking at the manuscript. He was looking at her, the condescension vanished, replaced by an expression uncomfortably close to awe. "If you wish to sell it to the museum, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her tone polite, detached, and utterly cold, "I suggest you tell them it provides vital primary insight into the logistical failures of the Roman supply chain. They will pay handsomely for the misery of a dead soldier." She turned her back on the Duke of Ravensmoor, walked to her drafty corner, sat down, and picked up her quill. The scholars remained speechless, and for the first time in his cynical, endlessly jaded life, the Duke of Ravensmoor had absolutely nothing to say. Rain lashed the single pane of glass in Eleanor's cramped Marylebone lodgings, blurring the gas lamps below into smeared yellow streaks. She sat wrapped in her only wool shawl, rubbing her bare hands together against the damp chill that had settled permanently into the floorboards. On the small deal table before her lay a single sheet of paper, a dismissal, written by Pemberton himself, his usually neat-hand spidery and frantic with residual panic. He accused her of insubordination, theft of intellectual property, and a total absence of feminine propriety, enclosing half a week's wages, less a gesture of goodwill than a desperate bribe to keep her from ever returning to the society. Eleanor stared at the 2 silver shillings resting atop the paper, catching the weak light of her sputtering tallow candle. 2 shillings. Enough for bread and perhaps a scuttle of low-grade coal to last the week. After that, she would join the invisible, desperate masses of women in London with neither husband nor fortune. She felt no regret. Regret was a luxury reserved for people with choices. When she closed her eyes, she still saw the stunned faces of those pompous academics, still felt the weight of an ancient Roman's fury on her tongue, the sharp bite of Latin consonants. It had been worth 2 shillings. A sharp, authoritative knock at the street door below made her jump. Nearly 10 o'clock. Respectable callers did not visit Marylebone boarding houses at this hour. Eleanor listened as her landlady, Mrs. Higgins, grumbled her way down the narrow hall. The front door groaned open, followed by a low exchange of voices, Mrs. Higgins's shrill protest, and a calm, dark baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Eleanor's spine. Footsteps ascended the stairs, heavy, measured, uncompromising. Her door did not click politely open. It swung wide, revealing the Duke of Ravensmoor filling the narrow frame, a heavy wool driving coat dark with rain across his shoulders, no hat, dark hair clinging to his forehead. In the oppressive confines of her 10-by-10 room he looked massive, dangerous, and entirely out of place. "Your landlady," Julian said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with a decisive click, "is under the impression I am here to compromise your virtue." I gave her a £5 note to assuage her moral outrage. Eleanor stood slowly, clutching her shawl tighter, her heart hammering though she forced her chin up, refusing to break eye contact. "If you have come to scold me on Pemberton's behalf, Your Grace, you are wasting your time. He has already terminated my employment." Julian glanced at the table, taking in the letter and the 2 miserable shillings, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Pemberton is a fool who couldn't translate a pub sign if it were written in English. I dismissed him this afternoon. That broke her practiced stoicism. Eleanor blinked. "You dismissed him? He isn't your employee." "I am the primary benefactor of the Royal Historical Society," Julian said calmly, unbuttoning his coat and draping it over the back of her only spare chair. "I fund their expeditions. I own their building leases. When I suggest a certain doctor of antiquities is a posturing fraud who relies on his underpaid copyist to do his thinking, the board tends to agree with me." He stepped further into the room, his cold grey eyes scanning her meagre belongings. The narrow bed, the threadbare rug, the stacks of heavily annotated Latin and Greek grammars piled precariously in the corner, not with pity but with the calculating assessment of a quartermaster surveying a battlefield. "Why are you here?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight. Julian stopped in front of her table and picked up one of the shillings, turning it over in his long fingers. "Because the box I brought to the society contained 50 more scrolls, all sealed just as tightly as the first. The British Museum wants them. Oxford wants them. I want to know what they say before I hand them to men who will sanitize the history out of them." He dropped the coin, it clattered sharply against the table. "I need a translator," he stated. "Someone who reads the mud, not just the marble. Someone who understands soldiers do not speak in poetry when they are freezing to death." Eleanor stared at him, the sheer audacity of the man staggering. "You want me to work for you?" "I want to hire the only competent classicist in London," he corrected, meeting her gaze. "You will be paid an honest wage, £50 for the completion of the box. You will work in my library in Mayfair. You will have a hot meal every day and a fire that does not smell of cheap rendered tallow." He glanced at her sputtering candle with mild distaste. £50. It was a staggering sum: independence, a proper flat, a winter coat, meat on Sundays. It was also an invitation into the private household of an unmarried, notoriously ruthless duke. "I am an unmarried woman, Your Grace," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a cautious, cynical register. "If I am seen entering your London house every day, society will draw a very specific, very ruinous conclusion." Julian scoffed, a short, dark sound. "Society already believes I am a ruined, misanthropic bastard. Let them talk. I will provide a carriage bearing the Ravensmoor crest. I will hire a chaperone to sit in the corner and knit if it preserves your delicate sensibilities. But I suspect, Miss Ashcombe, you care about society's opinion exactly as much as I do." He was entirely right, and she hated him a little for seeing it so clearly. Eleanor looked at the dismissal letter, then up at the Duke. He was not looking at her with desire or pity or the casual cruelty she had come to expect from men of his station. He was offering a transaction between equals. "I require a proper desk," Eleanor said, her tone hardening into a business-like clip. "I will not work on a tea table. I need fresh O'Gauling, not the watered-down slurry Pemberton bought." And I demand the right to refuse any translation I find degrading. Julian's lips twitched, not the arrogant smirk from the library, but a genuine, fleeting glimpse of respect. Done, he said softly. He drew a folded parchment from his waistcoat and set it beside the shillings. A formal contract. My carriage will collect you tomorrow at 8. He turned toward the door, retrieving his damp coat, and did not look back as he opened it. Good night, Miss Ashcombe. Try not to declare yourself emperor before morning. Ravensmoor House was a fortress of limestone and mahogany, a stark contrast to the flimsy, draft-ridden architecture of Eleanor's usual world. A stoic butler ushered her through heavy double doors with the practiced indifference of a man who asked no questions. The library spanned the entire west wing, smelling richly of beeswax, ancient paper, and a faint hint of sandalwood, floor-to-ceiling shelves groaning beneath thousands of volumes, unlike Pemberton's chaotic, dust-choked office, a sanctuary of meticulously organized knowledge. In its center sat a massive claw-footed mahogany desk. The iron-bound Roman chest rested on a side table nearby. Julian was already there, seated in a leather wingback chair near a roaring hearth, his bad legs stretched straight before him, no coat, only a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, a glass of amber liquid balanced on the armrest. He looked less like a duke and more like a weary soldier resting between marches. He did not rise when she entered, only nodded toward the desk. Your tools are prepared, Miss Ashcombe. Eleanor approached the workspace. He had kept his word. A thick stack of pressed vellum waited beside a heavy crystal inkwell filled with dark, rich ink, 3 freshly sharpened quills laid in a neat row, a comfortable, sturdy chair pulled up to the wood. It was an environment built for serious work. She removed her worn pelisse, ignoring the self-conscious tug at her threadbare sleeves, sat, and drew the first sealed scroll from the open chest, its wax crumbling slightly under her fingers, brittle with centuries of age. For the next 4 hours the only sounds in the vast library were the crackle of the fire, the occasional clink of Julian's glass, and the steady, rhythmic scratch of Eleanor's quill. The lockbox belonged to a man named Duchess, a trove of letters he had never sent, a diary of mounting despair and furious wit. He wrote of the relentless British reign, the incompetence of his commanders, the terrifying painted warriors who emerged from the fog to slaughter Roman patrols before vanishing back into the trees. Eleanor translated with fierce, consuming focus, not merely reading the words but inhabiting the soldier's mind, smoothing out his frantic grammar while capturing the raw terror and black humor that served as his only defense against madness. We lost 3 more men to the bogs yesterday, Eleanor wrote, her hand moving rapidly across the page. The centurion claims they deserted. I know they sank. The ground here hates us as much as the people do. I traded my bronze mirror for a pair of thick wool socks woven by a local woman. I suspect she cursed them, but my toes are finally warm, so the gods can argue over my soul. She stopped, resting her cramping hand, and let out a soft, unintentional sigh. Bad news from the front, Julian said. Eleanor jumped slightly, she had not realized he'd moved. He stood near the edge of the desk, looking down at her translation, smelling of rain and clean linen. Lucius is losing his faith in the empire, Eleanor murmured, tracing the edge of the ancient scroll. He realizes civilizing the world mostly involves standing in freezing water waiting to die. Julian's expression darkened, the coldness in his eyes shifting into something heavy and deeply familiar. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of her freshly written page. Realizing your commanders view you as expendable is a hard pill to swallow. It usually happens around the 3rd month of a winter campaign, when the supply lines fail and the glory washes away in the mud. Eleanor looked up at him, remembering the rumors, the peninsula, the brutal sieges, the slight limp he tried so hard to conceal. He was no longer talking about Roman Britain. Did you write letters you never sent, Your Grace? She asked, the question slipping out before her professional filter could catch it, too personal, too invasive for an employee to ask a duke. Julian did not flinch, nor offer a polite deflection. He looked directly into her eyes, the cynical armor dropping for a fraction of a second. I wrote lists, he said quietly, of the men we buried. I thought if I wrote their names down, the War Office couldn't pretend they never existed. I was, of course, entirely wrong. He pulled his hand back, the heavy, imposing mask of the Duke sliding seamlessly back into place. Keep translating, Miss Ashcombe. Let us see if our friend Lucia survives the winter. He turned and walked back toward the fire, his limp slightly more pronounced than before. Eleanor watched him go, then looked back down at the scroll, the anger of a dead Roman soldier staring up at her. She dipped her quill into fresh ink. The work was no longer merely a job. It was an excavation of grief, bridging centuries of mud, blood, and men sent to die in the rain. She began to write again, the scratch of her quill matching the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of shared, unspoken ghosts. Weeks bled into a quiet, rhythmic routine within the walls of Ravensmoor House. The shock of the arrangement faded, replaced by the steady, demanding work of history. Eleanor arrived every morning at 8 in a carriage bearing the Ravensmoor crest, ignoring the whispers of her neighbours and the scandalised stares of the crossing sweepers. The library had become her entire world. They argued over the translations constantly, not the bickering of employer and subordinate but the sharp intellectual sparring of equals. It means baggage, Eleanor insisted one Tuesday afternoon, tapping her quill against a stubborn sheet of vellum. He is complaining about the impedimenta, the supply train. Julian leaned over her desk, close enough that she could smell the bergamot soap he used and the faint metallic tang of ink. He had dropped Miss Ashcombe sometime during their second week, a casualty of late nights and shared exhaustion. He points to a cluster of cramped Latin characters. Look at the context, Eleanor. He says the impedimenta is bleeding them dry. You don't bleed over wagons of grain. He's talking about the camp followers, the wives, the merchants, the hangers-on who follow a marching army and slow it down. It's a military reality. The baggage train isn't just wooden canvas. It's people. She looked at the text again, hating that he was right, mostly because it happened with frustrating frequency when it came to the ugly logistics of war. She struck out her previous line and rewrote it. Fine, she muttered. The human baggage. Lucius is terribly annoyed the blacksmith's wife keeps slowing down the vanguard. Julian let out a low, rough chuckle and returned to his armchair by the fire, picking up his discarded newspaper. It was these moments, the casual corrections, the shared quiet, that felt infinitely more dangerous to Eleanor than any gossip in the streets. She was beginning to like him. It was a terrible, perilous complication. The heavy mahogany doors slammed open. Ferris, the usually unflappable butler, stumbled backward, desperately trying to block the path of a red-faced, furious man in a tightly tailored plum-coloured coat. I told you, Lord Ashworth, his grace is not to be disturbed, Ferris said, straining to maintain his professional cadence. Nonsense. Ravensmoor is always disturbed, Ashworth snapped, shoving past the older man and marching into the centre of the library, his walking stick striking the floorboards like a gavel. Eleanor froze, her hand tightening around her quill until it snapped. Lord Ashworth was a senior trustee of the British Museum, a man who wielded his inherited influence like a bludgeon. He stopped abruptly, his pale eyes darting from Julian, slowly lowering his newspaper, to Eleanor, frozen behind the massive oak desk. His face twisted into a sneer of ugly comprehension. Well, Ashworth drawled, leaning his weight onto his silver-tipped cane. Pemberton said you had lost your mind, Ravensmoor. I assumed it was merely your usual misanthropy, but I see you've turned your library into a brothel, a highly literate one, I suppose, but a brothel nonetheless. The silence that followed was absolute, not the quiet of a library but the drop in pressure before a cannon fires. Julian did not stand immediately. He folded his newspaper with deliberate, excruciating slowness, placed it on the table beside his chair, and rose, his limp completely absent, swallowed by sheer coiled tension. Ferris, Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion, you may leave us. The butler bowed hastily and pulled the door shut. I came for the lockbox, Ashworth said, though his bravado had slipped a fraction, puffing out his chest to hold his ground. The museum has a legal right to primary historical artifacts unearthed on British soil. You cannot hoard them here while you play house with your... Finish that sentence, Ashworth, Julian said, his voice a whisper that carried across the room like a cracking whip. He took a slow, measured step forward. Say the word. Let us see what happens to your jaw. Ashworth swallowed hard, his knuckles whitening on his cane. The Historical Society is in an uproar. You dismissed their finest scholar and absconded with priceless relics, and for what? So a disgraced copyist can pretend to translate a dead language? It is an insult to the crown. Eleanor stood, her knees trembling violently though she locked them into place. She would not cower behind a desk while arrogant men debated her worth. I am currently translating the third scroll of a secondary cohort, my lord, Eleanor said, her voice ringing out clear and icy. He details the architectural flaws in the Roman fort at Camulodunum, flaws Dr. Pemberton, in his infinite wisdom, previously mistook for a recipe for barley stew. Ashworth glared at her. Keep your mouth shut, girl. This is a matter for gentlemen. There is only one gentleman in this room, Julian said, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides, invading Ashworth's space, looming over the smaller man, the dark, dangerous veteran bleeding through the aristocratic veneer. The lockbox is my property. Miss Ashcombe is my employee, and if you ever force your way into my home and insult her again, I will not bother calling you out to a duel. I will simply beat you bloody on the pavement outside the museum. Do you understand me? Ashworth backed away, his face pale, his cane wobbling, looking from Julian's murderous expression to Eleanor's unyielding stance. He had expected a cowering mistress and an embarrassed duke. He had found a firing squad. You are making a mockery of society, Ravensmore, Ashworth spat, still retreating toward the doors. She will ruin whatever is left of your reputation, and when you tire of her, she will have nothing. He turned and fled, the heavy doors slamming behind him. Eleanor sank back into her chair, the adrenaline draining from her limbs, leaving her hollow and incredibly cold. Ashworth's final words echoed in the sudden silence. When you tire of her, she will have nothing. It was the brutal, unvarnished truth of her situation, entirely dependent on the whim of a volatile duke. Julian stood near the door for a long moment, rubbing a hand over his face, his broad shoulders rising and falling in a slow, heavy breath, then turned and looked at her. He offered no apologies for Ashworth's behavior, nor hollow reassurances. He knew she was too smart for them. Camulodunum, Julian said quietly, walking back toward the desk, stopping a respectful distance away. Is that what the third scroll says? The fort is flawed? Eleanor looked down at her ink-stained fingers and nodded slowly. Lucius says the walls are too low. There is no drainage in the eastern quadrant. If a siege lasts more than a week, they will drown in their own mud before the enemy ever breaches the gates. Julian held her gaze. Then we had best keep translating. I want to know if he survives the mud. Frost hardened the window panes of the library by late November, turning the glass into sheets of opaque, glittering ice. The fire roared constantly, consuming cord after cord of wood, but the cold still crept over the floorboards. They had reached the bottom of the lockbox, only 3 scrolls remained. Eleanor handled the vellum with excruciating care. The wax seals on these final documents were different, hasty, messy smears pressed with a thumb rather than a signet ring. The handwriting had changed too. The cynical, sprawling cursive of Lucius the Tribune had fractured, the letters jagged, deeply etched into the skin, the ink splattered as if the quill had been driven by a shaking hand. Julian sat opposite her at the desk now instead of retreating to his armchair. For 3 days, as the dates in the letters crept closer to the autumn of the year 61, he had anchored himself across from her, eyes fixed on the crumbling pages. Year of the consulship of Sicenius Petus, Eleanor murmured, tracing the harsh opening line. It's late summer. The tone, it's entirely broken. She dipped her quill, her stomach tying itself into a tight, heavy knot, and began to read the Latin aloud, translating as the words formed in her mind, her voice dropping to a near whisper. They are coming. The scouts rode in at dawn, their horses blown and bleeding. There are no numbers anymore, only a sea of them, painted in woad, screaming like furies. The Queen of the Iceni leads them. Boudica. We thought we broke her when they scourged her in the square. We did not break her. We forged a sword, and now it is at our throats. Eleanor swallowed hard, the terror bleeding through the centuries suffocating. She looked across the desk at Julian. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped in his cheek, his eyes dark and distant, fixed on a war fought 1800 years ago that sounded entirely too familiar. "Keep going," he said, his voice gravel. Eleanor returned to the text. "The 9th Legion is gone. Petilius Cerialis marched out to meet them, the arrogant fool. He thought Roman steel would rout a mob of farmers. They butchered the infantry in the marshes. Only the cavalry escaped. We are alone in Camulodunum. The walls are too low, just as I wrote to you. The veterans pray in the temple of Claudius. They think the marble will save them. I know better. Stone burns when the fire is hot enough." Her quill scratched furiously across the paper. She could almost smell the smoke, hear the roar of the tribes descending on the unprepared colony. She picked up the final scroll, small, barely a scrap of vellum. "I am burying this box beneath the foundations of the baths," Eleanor read, her voice beginning to tremble, the jagged Latin swimming in her vision. "We fall back to the temple tomorrow. The city is already burning. I can hear the screaming from the lower districts. The women, the children, they are showing us the exact mercy we showed them. None." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Read the end, Eleanor," Julian ordered gently. "I will not see Rome again. I will not see the Tiber, or the olive groves, or you, my brother. Do not pray to the gods for me. Pray that I have the strength to use my dagger on myself before they drag me from the temple steps. Farewell." Eleanor set the quill down. It rolled off the parchment and clattered onto the mahogany desk. The silence in the library was crushing, the silence of a graveyard. Lucius had died in the mud and ash of a burning colony, trapped in a temple that became a furnace, his cynical wit snuffed out by the brutal reality of an empire's overreach. Julian stood, his chair scraping violently against the floor, and walked to the side table where a crystal decanter of brandy waited. He poured a heavy measure, his hand, usually steady and absolute, shaking as the glass clinked against the rim. He did not drink it. He gripped the glass, staring into the roaring fire. "They always tell you about the glory," Julian said, his voice stripped bare of the Duke's arrogant armor, the raw, broken sound of a soldier beneath. "They tell you about the flags and the honor of the regiment. They never tell you about the noise, the sound a man makes when he realizes the cavalry isn't coming. When he realizes he is just a number on a ledger in Whitehall and his life is being traded for a few yards of Spanish dirt." Eleanor watched his back, the broad shoulders that carried the weight of a dukedom looking incredibly fragile in the firelight. She did not offer a platitude. She did not tell him it was all right. It hadn't been all right for Lucius, and it wasn't all right for Julian. She stood, crossed the room on legs that felt heavy, and stopped beside him, looking into the flames, then slowly, deliberately, reached out, not to grab him, only to rest her ink-stained hand against his forearm, over the fine wool of his sleeve. It was a grounding anchor, a physical tether to the present. Julian stiffened for a fraction of a second, then exhaled a long, shuddering breath, lowering his head to stare down at her small, scarred hand resting on his arm. He did not pull away. He leaned into the touch, just a millimeter, transferring a fraction of his invisible, crushing weight onto her. "We translated his truth," Eleanor said quietly, looking up at his sharp, shadowed profile. "The museum would have buried the final scroll. They would have claimed he died heroically, singing praises to the emperor. We let him speak." Julian turned his head, looking down at her, the distance between them practically non-existent, the cold grey storm in his eyes settling into something deep, heavy, and profound. "Yes," he murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "We did." For a long moment neither of them moved. The ghosts of the Roman dead and the fallen of the peninsula stood quietly in the corners of the library, leaving the two of them entirely, painfully alive in the center of the room. Ink stained the cuffs of Eleanor's newest blouse, a crisp high-collared garment purchased with her first installment of wages, a practical piece of grey poplin replacing her threadbare muslin. She stared at the dark smudge on the cuff, then down at the proof sheets scattered across the massive mahogany desk. They were not sending the translated scrolls to the British Museum. Julian had made the decision 3 nights earlier, standing by the fire with a glass of brandy and a look of absolute, terrifying resolve. He refused to hand Lucius's frantic, muddy truth over to men like Lord Ashworth, men who would lock the vellum in a dark vault and publish a sanitized summary insisting the Roman soldiers died singing hymns to the emperor. Instead, Ravensmoor used his vast fortune to hire a radical printer on Fleet Street, a man accustomed to seditious pamphlets and banned poetry, who cared nothing for the outrage of the Royal Historical Society. "Read the title page again," Julian ordered from his usual chair by the hearth, feigning nonchalance, his long legs stretched out, his eyes sharp and fixed entirely on her. Eleanor picked up the heavy cream-colored proof sheet, her hands shaking. She had spent her entire adult life hiding behind the names of mediocre men, watching her brilliant syntax and flawless grammatical deductions published under the credentials of fools. She swallowed past the tight knot in her throat and read aloud, the Camulodunum Letters, a first-hand account of the Boudiccan Rebellion from the 20th Legion, translated from the original Latin by Eleanor Ashcombe. She stopped. The silence in the library felt heavy, charged with strange, terrifying electricity. "You left your own name off the cover," she said softly, looking up at him. "You funded the excavation. You funded the printing. You are a duke. If your name is on it, the press might hesitate to tear it to shreds." "If my name is on it," Julian replied, his voice a low, steady rumble, "they will assume I did it and put my mistress's name on the cover as a scandalous joke. I will not have your intellect dismissed as my parlor trick. You did the work, Eleanor. You owned the mud. I merely provided the shovel." It was the most profoundly respectful thing any man had ever said to her. It terrified her more than Ashworth's threats ever could. When the bound volumes hit London's booksellers a week later, the reaction was immediate and violently explosive. Society did not want to read about Roman soldiers freezing to death in the bogs. They certainly did not want to read about an empire crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance, outmaneuvered entirely by a woman covered in ink. And they absolutely, unequivocally refused to accept that a destitute spinster from Marylebone had corrected the foundational historical timeline established by Oxford's finest scholars. Dr. Pemberton published a scathing, hysterical editorial in the Times, calling the translation a complete fabrication, accusing Eleanor of forging the emotional tone, claiming no Roman soldier would write with such degenerate, unmanly hysteria. Lord Ashworth circulated rumours through the gentlemen's clubs that the Duke of Ravensmoor had lost his mind to a scheming, manipulative harpy. Eleanor read the papers in the quiet sanctuary of the Ravensmoor Library, trying to maintain her cynical armour, but the viciousness of the attack stung. They did not attack her scholarship. They attacked her gender, her poverty, and her character. "Stop reading that garbage," Julian said one afternoon, plucking the newspaper directly from her hands and tossing it onto the blazing fire. Eleanor watched the paper curl and blacken in the flames. "They are going to ruin you, Julian. You are bleeding social capital by the hour. The House of Lords will stop recognizing you." "Let them," he said, stepping closer, his large frame blocking the light from the arched window, smelling of cold air and sharp cologne. "I survived a French bayonet in my thigh, Eleanor. I think I can survive being ignored by a few inbred earls at Almack's." He reached out, fingers grazing her jaw to force her to look at him, his touch warm, slightly rough, intensely grounding. "The translation is flawless," he said quietly, his grey eyes boring into hers, "and they know it. They are screaming because you have proven them obsolete. The lockbox is empty. The work is finished. The question now is not what they think of you. The question is what you intend to do next." Eleanor's breath hitched. The work is finished. It was the truth she had been fiercely avoiding. The £50 sat securely in a new leather reticule. The scrolls were locked in a glass display case Julian had commissioned. Her contract was fulfilled. She had no reason to return to Ravensmoor House tomorrow at 8. I suppose, Eleanor forced the words past her lips, trying to keep her tone brisk and professional. I should seek a position as a governess. With £50, I could afford to move to a respectable town, and if you so much as mention teaching French vocabulary to snot-nosed children, Julian interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper, I will throw you in the fire with the newspaper. His thumb brushed across her lower lip, silencing her completely. You are not leaving this house, Eleanor. Crystal glasses chimed against silver plates. The dining room of Ravensmoor House was a masterpiece of intimidating wealth, illuminated by 3 massive gaslit chandeliers casting long, sharp shadows against the damask wallpaper. Julian sat at the head of the long table, wearing a severe black evening coat that made him look less like a peer of the realm and more like an executioner. Eleanor sat at the opposite end, in a deep emerald silk gown, an unapologetic gift from Julian she had finally stopped refusing, simple, lacking the ridiculous flounces popular with débutantes, but fitted perfectly, making her look like a queen holding court. Between them sat the enemy. Julian had not cowered from the scandal. He had invited it to dinner, sending out 8 invitations to the most vocal critics of the Camulodunum letters, including Lord Ashworth and Dr. Pemberton, who had accepted out of morbid curiosity and the arrogant belief they could humiliate the Duke and his upstart translator in his own home. The first 2 courses passed in suffocating polite tension, Graves, no, Ferris, pouring the wine with a face carved from stone. It was over the roasted venison that Ashworth finally dropped the pretense. I must admit, Ravensmoor, Ashworth sneered, swirling deep red wine in his glass, the forgery is highly entertaining. I suppose writing fiction is a suitable pastime for a woman of limited prospects. Pemberton snickered from his seat midway down the table. Indeed, the syntax in the final scroll is entirely fabricated, a complete deviation from classical structure. It reads like a cheap penny dreadful. Eleanor placed her silver fork down on the porcelain plate, the tiny clink echoing loudly in the cavernous room. She did not look at Julian. She did not need his permission, and he knew better than to offer it, sitting back in his chair, swirling his own wine, a dark, expectant gleam in his cold grey eyes. He was unleashing his weapon. Dr. Pemberton, Eleanor said, her voice not loud but possessing a razor-sharp clarity that cut through the low murmurs of the men, in your prior publication on the military outposts of Britannia, you argued the Roman supply lines were flawlessly maintained until the winter of 65. Is that correct? Pemberton blinked, caught off guard, puffing out his chest. It is a widely accepted historical fact. Yes, fascinating, Eleanor replied, picking up her wine glass, meeting his gaze with absolute unblinking disdain, because in the second scroll, Lucius explicitly details the corruption of the quartermasters at Londinium in the autumn of 60. They were substituting grain with sawdust. Furthermore, the syntax you claim is fabricated, the fragmented use of the ablative is identical to the curse tablets unearthed in Bath 3 years ago. Tablets you yourself authenticated, Doctor. A heavy, painful silence descended on the table. Pemberton's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of purple. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Perhaps, Eleanor continued, her tone conversational but deadly, you fail to recognize the grammatical shift because you rely entirely on standardized glossaries. Lucius was dying in a burning temple. I imagine he cared very little for proper conjugation while his walls were collapsing. Men in terror do not speak in poetry, Dr. Pemberton. They scream. See here, Ashworth slammed his hand onto the table, the silverware rattling, turning his fury on Julian. Are you going to allow this woman to insult a respected scholar at your own table? She isn't insulting him, Arthur, Julian drawled smoothly, taking a sip of his wine. She is dismantling him. There is a distinct difference. One is rude. The other is entirely necessary. You are a fool, Ravensmoor, Ashworth spat, pushing his chair back violently. She has manipulated you. She is nothing but a fraud who memorized a few parlor tricks. Eleanor did not flinch. She rose slowly, the heavy emerald silk whispering against the floorboards, and walked around the table, her footsteps measured and calm, until she stood directly behind Ashworth's chair. "Lord Ashworth," she said, leaning down slightly so her voice carried exclusively to the men frozen in their seats, "if I am a fraud, I invite you to translate the inscription on the ring you currently wear on your right hand." Ashworth froze, instinctively pulling his hand closer to his chest. It was a heavy gold signet ring he claimed was an authentic Roman artifact, one he flaunted at every museum gala. "It is an imperial seal," Ashworth blustered, his face pale. "It is a merchant's tally," Eleanor corrected softly, her voice echoing in the dead quiet of the room. "The inscription reads, Queen's Tax Collector, 5 pigs, 3 cows. You have been attending galas for a decade wearing a Roman butcher's receipt on your pinky finger." Someone at the end of the table, an elderly earl from the museum board, let out a sudden, explosive snort of laughter, quickly covered with a napkin, but the damage was done. The facade of Ashworth's unassailable dignity shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He stood, his face a mask of pure humiliated rage, looked at Eleanor, then the laughing earl, then finally at Julian, who watched him with a terrifying predatory smile. Ashworth threw his napkin onto his plate, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the dining room. Pemberton, pale and sweating, scurried after him like a frightened rat. Eleanor stood by the empty chairs, her heart hammering violently. She had burned every bridge to polite society in under 5 minutes. She looked down the length of the table. The remaining guests stared at her, shock, fear, and reluctant or painted across their faces. Then Julian stood, raised his wine glass, his cold grey eyes locked entirely on Eleanor, ignoring every other man in the room. "To the mud," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. Eleanor met his gaze, a fierce, brilliant smile breaking across her face. She picked up Ashworth's abandoned wine glass from the table and raised it in return. "To the mud," she replied. Ferris closed the heavy double doors of Ravensmoor House, the final iron lock snapping into place, sealing the damp November fog outside. The remaining dinner guests had fled shortly after Ashworth's humiliating retreat, offering hasty excuses, entirely avoiding Eleanor's gaze. She stood alone in the center of the library, the fire burned down to glowing red embers casting long, bruised shadows across the mahogany shelves. The adrenaline that carried her through the dining room was evaporating, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. She traced the edge of the desk. Her desk! It was a temporary illusion, a luxury purchased by a temporary contract. The work was fulfilled. The money was paid. She thought of her father, a man who had loved the rhythm of dead languages more than the practicalities of living, who had taught her to revere the marble statues of Rome. But it was Julian who had taught her the value of the dirt beneath their sandals. Footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor, slow, measured, lacking the heavy military cadence of a man marching to war. Julian entered the room, his severe black evening coat discarded, his cravat hanging loose around his neck, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone. He looked battered, as though he had just survived a brutal, drawn-out siege, yet his grey eyes were intensely, violently alive. He walked to the side table, poured 2 heavy measures of brandy, crossed the room, and handed her a glass, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact sent a jolt of heat straight through her chilled blood, cutting through the numbness of the evening. "You realize," Julian said, taking a slow sip of his drink, his voice dropping into the quiet of the room, "you are now entirely unemployable in the City of London. Ashworth will spend the next 10 years ensuring no academy, museum, or private library allows you within 50 feet of a manuscript." Eleanor looked down at the amber liquid in her glass and took a steadying drink. It burned on the way down, a harsh, necessary grounding. "I have £50. I could move to Yorkshire. I hear the sheep are very forgiving of improper syntax." "You would go mad in Yorkshire within a fortnight," Julian replied, stepping closer, the heat radiating from his large frame a physical pressure in the quiet room. "You need a war, Eleanor. You need a puzzle to break, or a fool to dismantle, or your mind will turn on itself." She looked up, meeting his unwavering stare, her cynical armor, so carefully maintained for years, feeling dangerously brittle. "And what do you propose, Your Grace?" That I stay here, a scandalous, unofficial fixture in your library, translating ghost stories while society waits for you to tire of the novelty? I will not be a kept woman. I have never once tired of you, he said, the roughness in his voice stripping away the last remnants of the arrogant duke, only the scarred veteran remaining. I have spent the last 5 years trapped in a city full of porcelain dolls who faint at the mere mention of mud. You didn't faint. You picked up a quill and made the mud immortal. He reached out carefully, taking the brandy glass from her trembling fingers and setting it on the edge of the desk, then stepped directly into her space rather than back. My estate in Devonshire has a library twice this size, Julian murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, intimate register that made her breath catch, filled with texts my ancestors stole from places they had no business being. Greek, Aramaic, corrupted Latin, vaults of it. It will take a lifetime to categorize. You are offering me another job, Eleanor breathed, her heart slamming against her ribs. No, he said, reaching up, his large, calloused hands framing her face, his thumb sweeping gently over her cheekbones, feeling the frantic pulse beneath her skin. I am offering you a partnership. I am asking you to marry me. Eleanor froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. I am a ruined copyist, Julian. I have no dowry. I have no pedigree. I am the daughter of a bankrupt teacher. If you make me your Duchess, the House of Lords will riot in the streets. Let them riot, Julian said fiercely, a dark, predatory smile curving his lips. We will invite them to dinner and translate their signet rings until they cry. I do not want a pedigree, Eleanor. I want a woman who understands that the empire is falling and who will stand in the fire with me until it burns down. He did not wait for a polite, choreographed acceptance. He kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative exploration. It was a collision, the desperate, grounded clash of two cynics who had finally found the only other person in the world who spoke their language. Eleanor grabbed the lapels of his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the solid, unyielding reality of him. He tasted of brandy, expensive tobacco, an absolute certainty. His arms wrapped tightly around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor, holding her as though he never intended to let her go. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the heavy, steady thud of his heart. It was a survivor's heartbeat. Devonshire, she whispered, her voice rough. Julian buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. Tomorrow we pack the lockbox, we take the carriage, and we leave them all to choke on their standardized glossaries. Eleanor smiled against his shirt, thinking of Lucius, dead in the ashes of a burning colony, his words finally free, thinking of the 50 pounds in her reticule and the ink that would permanently stain her fingers. She had walked into a drafty, miserable corner of the world expecting to disappear. Instead she had found a man who handed her a sword. All right, she said, looking up into the stormy grey eyes of the Duke of Ravensmoor. Let's go read the mud.